Hello, everybody, and welcome to this short video on foundations of instructional planning. The video will take about 15 minutes. Why is this important? Well, first of all, let's think about all the things that you plan in your daily life. Give it a thought. In general, we plan everything we do. We plan what time we get up, we plan what we're going to have for breakfast, we organize our day, and that in itself is planning. So planning is a natural thing that we do in everyday life. However, when it comes to teaching, planning has a specific kind of meaning. And this is what we're going to see today, and we're going to see how this can be translated into good learning for our learners. Let's start by defining what a lesson plan is. It is a teaching strategy which is designed to promote students' learning. As a strategy, we have to realize it can be successful or unsuccessful. And we need to know that those strategies are informed. I mean, we don't just plan something based on nothing. We plan, for example, based on the diagnosis of a learner's needs, what we saw in the learning needs instrument, but also this strategy is informed by methodology, by theory, and what we consider best practices in teaching, what is done and is considered to be good ways of teaching students so that that teaching results in students learning. As a strategy, it is carefully thought out. We look at the learning outcomes, exactly what students should be able to do. We look at what we want to teach. And we also, when we teach, have our own personal aims. These personal aims is what I want to improve. I want to improve the way I explain vocabulary, or I want to improve how I give instructions, etc. Now, we know that during lessons, students do activities, ¿verdad? Right? But in between those activities, there should be transitions. That is to say, it's not a collection of individual activities. There's a flow. And in general, when you ask a student, how did you do in school today? What did you do in school today? They just go like teenagers, like nothing. So we need to make them aware of the takeaways. What is it that you're taking from this lesson? What learning? And I, as a teacher, also have to think about the lessons learned. What have I learned about teaching and my students as a consequence of teaching this lesson? We need to understand that developing strategies takes time. It cannot happen overnight. And particularly at the beginning, you're going to experience, like we spend a lot of time in planning. With time and with practice and with more experience, your planning will be easier. But remember that planning should be focused on what students should be able to do at the end of the lesson. That is to say, activities are essential to promoting learner. Just the teacher talking does not do it. And we need to acknowledge that strategies, no matter how well planned they can change because the students are going to change and because you are going to change. So, what planning decisions do we make? What goes into a lesson plan? That is a complex question. Because as the sign there says, this way, that way, the other way, there are many ways of putting together a lesson plan. We're going to use one particular template that we're going to discuss in class the next time that we meet. But for the time being, look at all the things that people say should be put into a lesson plan. Now, if we were to put all these things, we would be just completing an administrative document, and that is not the idea. What the lesson plan does for you is make explicit your thinking as a teacher, and it helps you guide the lesson that you're going to teach. But as such, it's not a straitjacket. So for the time being, just think about all these things that you can read and think, what would I personally choose to include in a lesson plan? We know that lessons have elements. A lesson has components, and there are some essential components, like, for example, the learning outcomes. What should students be able to do at the end of the lesson? Of course, we have to start with the opening. The opening has to cause an impression on the student so that they can focus on what we're going to be doing. And this is the engaged part of the lesson we have been discussing. And it activates what the students may know about the topic, for example, the vocabulary they're going to use, the language, the ideas. Then there should be a sequence of activities. A lesson is not just one activity, it's more than one activity. And these activities should be thought out, taking into consideration the learning outcome. Now, these activities need to be connected. They cannot be individually given. Otherwise, it's not a lesson, it's a collection of activities. A lesson is cohesive. And for that, we need transitions. And at the end, as I said, we need a closure. The last 5 minutes of the lesson, no matter whether you have completed your lesson plan or not, just stop 5 minutes before the bell rings and ask the students what they have learned. What are the takeaways from the lesson? I would like to see you all doing this sequence in every single lesson that you do. Learning outcomes. Most important thing is you have to remember these are for students, not just for you. So they are based on what the students already know and what they should be able to do as a consequence of your teaching. They anticipate what they should be able to do. They guide the development of the lesson. You have to think that your activities, your selection of activities have to be aligned with the learning outcome. And the starting point is generally going to be what we call a language function. And I will explain that in a minute. But a language function is what we do with the language. It's not about knowing the language, it's about using the language. And that is what differentiates a good lesson from a grammar lesson. Don't get me wrong, there are times when you're going to teach a grammar lesson, but in general, you will want the students to do something with the language. But because you cannot guarantee that because you teach them, they will learn, we write the learning outcomes in conditional terms. So the phrase that we are going to use for learning outcomes is a set phrase, is by the end of the lesson, students should be able to complete a dialogue, working orally with a friend, with a high degree of accuracy. They should be able to answer 7 questions regarding a text they have read and explain the evidence from the text, etc. Now, when we talk about language functions, as I said, we're talking about things that we do with a language. It's not knowing about the language. A function is not, for example, the simple present or the present perfect or the past continuous. These are all tenses. Vocabulary about food is not a language function. Functions imply doing things with a language. And I've taken from this online training institute, the School of TESOL, Teaching English as a Second Language, this very comprehensive list of functions to give you an idea. So what could a learning outcome focus on? In general, traditionally, we focus on linguistic aspects, right? To get the students to talk about the past, that is linguistic, right? And if you look at the functions, that doesn't appear as a function. So we're going to leave the linguistic aspects aside, but we're going to focus on skills development. Skills are listening, reading, speaking, and writing. They should be able to listen to a conversation and identify who the speaker are and what they are speaking about. That is a function. They could focus on learning development. Students should be able to predict the content of a text from the title of the reading. That is learning developing. They are learning a strategy. And you can focus on interpersonal communication as well. Sorry. Or communication in general. Students are going to share anecdotes about their life as primary school students. How do we write the learning outcomes? This is the ABC model for writing learning outcomes, and it's a good guide. I'm going to ask you to use it when you write your learning outcomes. A good learning outcome has an audience, that is to say, who is the target audience? For example, Form 5 students or students in one Jasmine, which is a way of calling a group, Or maybe if you're teaching technical vocational, the job seeker or the carpenter or the plumber. The behavior is what you want them to do, what is the work to be accomplished by the learner. And if you look at this, they should be able to write a note, they should be able to describe the steps, they should be able to answer simple questions. So you see, all these are concrete, activity-oriented, observable things. Not they should be able to know or they should be able to understand, because we don't know what knowing means or understanding means. We need to be able to see it. After the audience and the behavior have been specified, we need to think in terms of the conditions. What are the conditions or constraints in which the learners will be expected to perform these tasks? For example, given a calculator, given a dictionary, or given the cell phone, given chapters 1-5 of Charlotte's Web, or, as we may say, working individually, working in groups, working in pairs. All those are conditions. And last but not least, we can specify the degree. How will the behavior need to be performed? Maybe in some cases without errors, if you have been doing practice of a particular vocabulary set or pronunciation pattern or grammar item, you want them to produce them without errors, or 9 out of 10 times, or within 60 seconds, within 5 minutes. If you write the learning outcomes in this way, you will be able to create your lessons in a much more guided and effective way. But then, as you select the activities, you're going to be listing activities that are all connected, and you will have to think, okay, why am I doing this? How does this activity connect to the learning outcome? So we are going to call those things, and you're going to have to include them, as stage aims. In this stage of the lesson, I want them to read because I want them to, etc., etc. How do you write these? In infinitive, to teach students this, to practice, to check comprehension, to revise, to organize, to foster pronunciation development or communication, or to promote group work. These are the aims, and they are for the students and for you. But if the learning outcomes are about the learning, these are about the teaching. So we need to look at, they help you align, as I said, the activities to the learning outcomes. So how do you move from here? Thinking about the different kinds of lessons that you can include. If you're teaching language, a straight arrow lesson is good. If you're promoting communication, a boomerang lesson is good. And if you are doing multi-skills development, a patchwork lesson may work. Please refer back to the video on these 3 kinds of lessons if you have any questions. Now, the lesson, you have to think, okay, what can they be doing to achieve this learning outcome? In that sense, it's based on activities where students are doing something. You have to remember that. It's not about the teacher teaching, it's about the students doing things. So what can they be doing? Listening, writing, speaking, reading, drawing, designing. Who with? Individually, in pairs, in small groups, as a whole class. We call these interaction patterns. What for? Maybe to share information, to share opinions, to solve a problem, because remember, we are starting from a function. What with? And there you have all the materials that you can use, right? Pictures, text, videos, audios, their ideas, their cell phone, a web page. And what else can they do? Well, as a consequence of that, they can become aware of new language, they can practice new language, or they can use new language. So a lesson is activity-oriented, and these activities need to be connected, as we said. That means that one activity should naturally build on the next activity or lead to the next activity, so that there is a flow in the lesson. And there should be no interruptions between the activities. Sometimes you may need to write down the transition. That has helped some student teachers. At other times, you just naturally build it into the lesson plan. And this may mean that to connect the activities, maybe the 2 you have already selected are not enough. You need to create a connecting activity. So remember that when we finish the lesson and we look back, people generally ask me, how good was my lesson? Or was my lesson good? And it's not about how good a lesson is or was. It is about what the learners learned and whether the learners learned. So it's about whether the learning outcomes have been achieved. We specified with the ABCD the minutia, the details of the student's performance, and that helps us decide whether the learning outcome has been achieved or not. And then it's about what students can do at the end of the lesson. Maybe they couldn't complete or achieve the learning outcome totally, but they achieved 50% of it. So always look at the positive, not the negative, what the student can do. And it's about learning. It's not about teaching. It's about what students, how students responded to your teaching. For you as a teacher, after the lesson has finished, you have some job to do. You have to reflect. You have to review the learning outcomes. You have to find explanations for what did not go according to plan. You can design alternatives to that and create solutions. And also think about how you are going to continue using what worked in this lesson in your future lessons, right? Because after all, and at the end of the day, the important thing is that you just think, after teaching this lesson, would I have liked to have been taught by me, as we say with Leslie in our book? That will tell you what you need to improve. And I will be close to you and your peers as well to support you in answering that question.